Few American mob bosses ever reached the level of fame, power, and notoriety that John Gotti did. In the 1980s, he wasn't just a crime boss. He was a celebrity. Cameras followed him. Crowds cheered him. And juries kept letting him walk free. They called him the Teflon Don because no charges ever seemed to stick. But behind his sharp suits, confident smile, and public swagger was a violent, ruthless man who ruled the Gambino crime family with fear, loyalty, and blood. So, who was John Gotti really? How did a kid from the Bronx rise to become the most powerful mafia boss in America? And how did it all come crashing down? This is the full story of John Gotti, the rise, the reign, and the fall of New York's most infamous mob boss. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, New York. He was the fifth of 13 children, raised in extreme poverty during a time when organized crime offered one of the few paths to fast money and respect. His parents were Italian Americans with distant mob connections, but they struggled to survive. His father worked as a laborer and often came home with little to show for it. John grew up angry, frustrated, and resentful, especially toward authority. School never interested him. By age 12, Gotti was already stealing, skipping classes, and running the streets with local gangs. At 16, he dropped out completely. One childhood accident would mark him for life. While attempting to steal a cement mixer from a construction site, it fell on his foot, crushing his toes. From that day on, John Gotti walked with a noticeable limp, a reminder of how early crime entered his life. Gotti found his place with the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a street gang tied to the Gambino crime family. Through them, he met men who would shape his future, including Angelo Ruggiero and Willie Boy Johnson. By his late teens, Gotti was working directly for the Gambinos, then known as the Anastasia crime family. He became a truck hijacker, stealing cargo from JFK Airport and selling it on the black market. His mentor was Carmine Charlie Wagons Fatico, a Gambino soldier who taught Gotti the rules of the life. Gotti proved himself fearless, violent, and dependable, the qualities mob bosses valued most. But crime came with consequences. In 1968, Gotti was arrested for hijacking a United Airlines truck. 2 months later, he was caught again stealing a truck loaded with cigarettes. This time, the judge had enough. Gotti was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. When he was released in 1972, he didn't slow down. He leveled up. Gotti became an enforcer, collecting debts, intimidating rivals, and running illegal gambling operations. He operated out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, a Gambino hangout that would later become infamous. Though not yet a made man, Gotti gained the attention of Neil Delacroce, the powerful Gambino underboss. Delacroce saw Gotti as a younger version of himself, violent, street smart, and loyal. In 1973, Gotti took part in the murder of James McBratney, a gangster suspected of killing a Gambino relative. Gotti helped restrain McBratney, while another mobster shot him dead. Once again, Gotti faced prison. He accepted a plea deal and served 4 more years. But when he came home, everything changed. By the late 1970s, Gambino boss Carlo Gambino had died. Instead of naming Delacroce as his successor, he chose Paul Castellano, a quiet, business-focused boss who banned drug dealing. The decision split the family. Street guys like Gotti hated Castellano. They saw him as weak, greedy, and out of touch. Gotti openly broke Castellano's drug rules, making millions on the side. When Gotti was released from prison in 1977, he was promoted to capo, running his own crew. He became rich through loan sharking, gambling, hijacking, and possibly drugs. In 1978, Gotti helped coordinate the Lufthansa heist, the largest cash robbery in U.S. history. Nearly $6 million vanished overnight. In 1980, tragedy struck Gotti's family. His 12-year-old son Frank was killed after being hit by a neighbor's minibike. Police ruled it an accident. Gotti didn't accept that. The neighbor, John Favara, was beaten by Gotti's wife and later disappeared. He was never seen again. Most believe the mob killed him brutally. From that moment on, Gotti became colder, angrier, and more dangerous. By 1985, tensions between Gotti and Castellano were at a breaking point. When Delacroce died of cancer, Gotti lost his protector. Castellano responded by planning to dismantle Gotti's crew. Gotti decided to act first. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and underboss Thomas Bilotti were gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Gotti watched from a nearby car. 1 month later, John Gotti became boss of the Gambino crime family. As boss, Gotti ruled openly. He wore custom suits, spoke to the press, and smiled for cameras. His courtroom wins turned him into a folk hero. In 1987, he beat a massive racketeering case after the jury was bribed. That's when the nickname stuck, the Teflon Don. He made millions each year and ran one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. But his biggest weakness was his ego. The FBI planted listening devices in the Ravenite Social Club. They recorded everything: murders, extortion, and Gotti insulting his own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Feeling betrayed and facing life in prison, Gravano flipped. In 1992, he testified against Gotti, detailing murders and inner circle secrets. This time, there was no escape. John Gotti was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Gotti spent his final years in solitary confinement. He died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002, at age 61. His funeral drew massive crowds. Even in death, he was a spectacle. John Gotti remains one of the most famous mob bosses in history, not because he was the smartest, but because he was the loudest. His story is a warning about ego, power, and believing your own myth. After John Gotti was finally convicted in 1992, many believed the era of the flashy, untouchable mob boss was over, and in many ways, it was. Gotti's downfall didn't just mark the end of his reign, it symbolized the collapse of the old Mafia myth that power could be sustained through fear, loyalty, and public bravado alone. For years, Gotti had lived like a celebrity. He walked freely through Manhattan in expensive suits, smiled for cameras, and embraced the nickname the Teflon Don because charges never seemed to stick. To the public, he looked invincible. To law enforcement, he was a humiliation that needed to be corrected. And to the Mafia itself, he was both an asset and a liability. What ultimately destroyed Gotti wasn't the FBI alone. It was ego. Unlike past bosses who operated in the shadows, Gotti thrived in the spotlight. He loved attention, media coverage, and the respect he believed it earned him. But that same visibility made him predictable, traceable, and vulnerable in an era where surveillance technology was rapidly improving. The wiretaps placed inside the Ravenite Social Club were devastating. For the first time, prosecutors didn't have to rely solely on informants or circumstantial evidence. They had Gotti's own words, complaining, ordering, insulting, and revealing the inner workings of the Gambino family. Every conversation chipped away at the legend. The final blow came from within. Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss and longtime enforcer, made a decision that would have been unthinkable in earlier Mafia generations. Faced with life in prison and feeling betrayed by Gotti's reckless leadership, Gravano flipped. His testimony exposed decades of murders, racketeering, and internal power struggles. For many old-school mobsters, Gravano's cooperation represented the ultimate betrayal, but it also reflected a new reality. Loyalty had limits and survival mattered more than tradition. The Mafia code that once held families together was eroding under pressure from long prison sentences and relentless law enforcement tactics. John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who once ruled New York's most powerful crime family would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. No suits, no spotlight, no crowds, just concrete walls and time. In prison, Gotti's health declined. He battled throat cancer while maintaining his innocence to the very end. Even as his body weakened, he never publicly admitted guilt, clinging to the image he had carefully crafted for decades. To Gotti, reputation was everything, and confession would have shattered the myth. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the age of 61 in a federal medical center. His death marked more than the end of a man, it marked the end of an era. The public funeral, attended by thousands, showed just how powerful his image still was. Some mourned him as a folk hero. Others saw the spectacle as proof of how deeply crime had embedded itself into popular culture. But behind the headlines and romanticized portrayals lies a harsher truth. John Gotti's leadership weakened the Gambino family. His hunger for attention invited law enforcement scrutiny that never let up. His decisions led to prison sentences for countless associates and accelerated the decline of the traditional mafia structure in New York. The organization that once thrived on secrecy and discipline was left fractured. Subsequent bosses were quieter, more cautious, and far less influential. The age of mob bosses becoming household names was over. Gotti's story also forces us to examine why figures like him continue to fascinate us. Was it his confidence, his defiance, or the illusion that he beat a system most people feel powerless against? The reality is more complex. Gotti didn't defeat the system, he delayed it, and when it caught up, it did so decisively. Pop culture has played a major role in preserving his legacy. Movies, documentaries, and books often portray Gotti as the last great gangster, a man who lived by his own rules. But those portrayals rarely linger on the damage left behind the victims, the families torn apart, and the communities destabilized by organized crime. Even within his own family, the cost was immense. His son, John Gotti Jr., attempted to follow in his footsteps, but never reached the same level of power. Instead, he faced legal troubles of his own, proving that legacy in the underworld is more curse than inheritance. In the end, John Gotti didn't fall because he lacked intelligence or influence. He fell because the world changed, and he refused to change with it. Surveillance replaced secrecy, cooperation replaced silence, and the myth of the untouchable mob boss was exposed for what it really was. John Gotti's life serves as a warning disguised as a legend. Power built on fear always attracts challengers. Loyalty bought through intimidation always expires. And fame, especially in the criminal world, is never protection. It's a spotlight. His story isn't one of victory. It's a lesson in excess, ego, and the high price of believing your own myth. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise and fall of John Gotti, hit the like button. It really helps support the channel. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Was Gotti a brilliant strategist, or did his ego guarantee his downfall? And if you want more true crime stories like this, watch the video below for another powerful deep dive into the underworld.